Hi, I'm Barrett Johnson with Choir, and I'm here with Matthew Korpman, and we're here to talk about his new book. What's the title of the book, Matt?
The title of my book is Saying No to God.
Okay, so what prompted you to write this book in the first place?
So, as you can tell from the title, it kind of evokes more questions than it really answers. Really, at the heart of this book are two kind of concepts. One is divine command theory, which is an ethical idea that if God says it, then that's what makes it true. And then on the other hand is the stories in the Bible that I remembered and knew growing up that featured Abraham arguing with God over the fate of Sodom, Moses arguing with God over the fate of the newly minted people of Israel who were at Mount Sinai, even say the story of Jacob wrestling the angel at the Jabbok River. And the problem I had when I was in an ethics class learning more about divine command theory was kind of how problematic it was for Scripture. In the sense that, yeah, it made sense on paper. Yes, it's what I heard always in church. But then these stories in the Bible struck me as really odd. Why was Abraham arguing with God if it's true that if God says it, that makes it right? Why is Moses arguing with God if that's what makes it right? And then what complicated it all is that God never tells them they're wrong. And in the case of Moses, it specifically says, and God changed his mind. Now, everybody has struggled with these texts in various ways or forms, but they usually are struggling over these texts in regards to God changing his mind. That's usually where the emphasis is. For me, it was the arguing part that I thought should be getting the emphasis. Why is it that the most faithful people in the Bible are arguing with God and not only getting away with it, but in the case of Moses, winning? That just struck me as something that made me say, I really should investigate this. And so this book kind of grew out of that desire to explore what does it mean to argue with God? What does it mean to say no to God? And how could that potentially reveal how to be a Christian in the 21st century?
That's a unique take on this. How would your book differ from other people who have written similar books on this same subject?
Yeah, for sure. In lots of ways. There's really no two ways about it. Books written about the Bible and how to read it usually fall into about two categories. You are either on the very progressive end of the spectrum, so we're talking like Marcus Borg. If you go over to conservative circles, the books get less deep and less dense, and they kind of just end up coming to basically the opinion of how to read the Bible. Well, believe it. So in this book, I really tried to take a middle-of-the-road approach. I tried to look at what was missing, where was the middle ground? And I tried to find that by looking at stories in the Bible of characters who would hear God tell them something, and then they wouldn't necessarily do it. And I thought that that was a really important sort of distinction to latch onto, because oftentimes when people talk about the Bible or scholarship, it always comes down to sort of inerrancy, or the question of, do you read the Bible as if, it's exactly God's words, or is it more impressions? And I found that these kinds of stories were really unique because it kind of undermined the whole premise of inerrancy. It doesn't really matter if God exactly said what it said God said, if even Abraham or Moses or a number of other characters still fight God on exactly what he said. It kind of doesn't make sense then to care about whether or not you have God's words, but rather to ask the question, what is God doing with those words?
When we had a conversation about this before, you also brought up examples of Jesus doing this in Scripture as well. You want to give a couple of those examples?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the kind of the most comical, but we don't really think of it that way, would be the story of his mother in the Gospel of John. In that story, we have Mary going ahead and coming to Jesus in the very opening of the book saying, the wine's run out. What are we going to do? And Jesus gives a very frank answer. And that answer is, it's not my time. Now, in John's Gospel, it's pretty, it's clear. Jesus is God. Jesus is the Word incarnate. There's no, questioning how human he is, etc. He's human and he's God. So it's all the more interesting that Jesus, God, says, no, it's not my time. And then Mary turns around, tells two servants, he's going to tell you to go do something, go do it. I mean, that shouldn't have happened. If Mary was, in a traditional Christian understanding, being a good, devout woman, shouldn't she have just accepted what God told her? Shouldn't she have just said, yes, God said it's not his time, so I'll trust his judgment. But she doesn't. And you see that also, again, in the story of the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, why should I give the food meant for the children to the dogs? And everyone focuses in on the fact that Jesus is using the racially charged language of the day for the Gentiles. But the more interesting part of it is that the woman rebuts Jesus, that she undermines his argument. She says, yeah, but you forgot, even the dogs eat the crumbs. And then in Mark's gospel, Jesus replies and says, for saying this, for rebutting me, for arguing I was wrong, your daughter has been healed. And in Matthew's gospel, it changes the language and it says, because of your act of faith. This rebutting me is an act of faith. That's what healed you. So you see this similar strange idea throughout the Old and the New Testament, even in the life of Jesus, about not just accepting what God says just because he said it, but actually pushing back because you know something deeper about God and you're trying to bring it out.
So if you had it your way, what would you want a reader to take from this book?
I would hope that the number one thing a reader would take from this book is that God, as he's presented in the scriptures, is not interested in a one-way conversation. In fact, he's actually interested in a conversation. And it's not a rhetorical conversation. It's really a dynamic between two people, a God who wants a faithful servant who understands him, and a faithful servant who wants to understand God. And really, what I try to outline, especially in the beginning of the book, is exploring how the Bible is far more interested in the character of God and in how our relationships define how others see his character than a question of whether or not there's authority that has to be answered to, whether or not God is simply interested in robots that know that when he says something, you do it. And that's important because oftentimes the parts of the Bible that people struggle with are the same parts that we see Moses, Abraham, Job, and others also struggling with, which is when God seems to present himself opposite of the way that we've come to know who God is. What's always interesting to me is that when Abraham has that happen, his first words are, "Far be it from you." What does that tell me? It tells me Abraham believes he already knows who God is, and he's calling God out for not seemingly being who he is. Same with Moses, who also says that. And so it begs this question that there's something deeper about the character of this God in Scripture than whether or not his commands are authoritative, but rather whether or not his heart is understood. And that's what I really hope that people take from that, and that all the rest that's in the book about biblical scholarship, about authorship, about inspiration, about bibliolatry, all these things ultimately comes down to Jesus, the character of God on display for humanity. That's really where I hope it comes down for most readers.
Matthew, thank you. Looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you for having me.
Matthew's book, Saying No to God, will be available on Amazon and other available retailers.